Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with Batman. And I know it's been a little while since we covered this. It's been quite some time since we covered the Batman comics, right? But like, we need to get caught up, right? Because there's some cool stuff coming down the pipe. So for those of you guys who are playing catch up, of course, you'll find the link to the previous video down in the description, so you can watch that and find out everything that's going on. But effectively what's happening here is James Tynion kind of kicked things off with his run on Batman following Tom King, and he introduced a character called the Designer. And we didn't really know anything about him, right? And there's been several videos across YouTube that have focused on the origin of the character, but the Designer was basically a guy who seemingly went to a handful of criminals in Gotham City and then basically said, like, I will help you guys achieve the goal of effectively taking the city over for yourself. And this seemed to happen a number of years ago. And so the implication was that a lot of the schemes and things that were going on in the city of Gotham with regards to the criminals were all based on the efforts of the Designer himself. And what this basically did is it led to the idea that the Designer seems to have returned and Batman is kind of caught up in this whole thing. Again, it's kind of interesting because it invokes like Deathstroke and it invokes a few other characters here and there, but we basically left off with the idea that Deathstroke's assassins, more or less, his henchmen for lack of a better word, had basically been taken, and then you end up picking up with Harley Quinn, who's basically controlling a bunch of these weapons belonging to Batman and is sending them after Deathstroke, right? So this part of the story kind of kicks off, it picks up with a bang, and it's kind of a cool thing because what it does is it switches back over to Catwoman and to Bruce Wayne. Now, one of the things that James Tynion kept going after the events of Tom King was the relationship between Catwoman and Bruce Wayne, and a lot of people really liked this, right? It just kind of made sense. One of the things that always kind of threw me off about Tom King's writing was the way that Batman and Catwoman talked to each other. Just never really seemed organic. James Tynion really seems to correct that, right? Tom King's writing was a little weird, but James Tynion really seems to correct that and basically giving us this seemingly organic conversation between the two. But because of the fact that Catwoman was one of the initial individuals who dealt with the Designer, she's the one that basically has all this information. And the response of Batman is, I need you to tell me everything that's going on. And so what this does is it gives us a kind of flashback with the origin of the Designer himself, insofar as it's given to us here. And what we basically learn is that at some point in the past, seemingly around 20 years ago, seems to be the indication that Catwoman was basically just a kind of burglar, right? She was in the early days of her career, but there was a kind of legend of a guy named the Designer, this individual out there that was responsible for pulling off some of the greatest heists that ever happened. It's cool here because he was almost kind of like this mythical, enigmatic figure, right? He existed, but it's one of these things where people were just kind of like, this guy's more myth than actual fact. And so what ended up happening is that there was basically a card sent to Catwoman that was essentially an invitation from the Designer to meet at a particular location. And when she arrives there, she's met by the Riddler, she's met by Joker, and she's met by Penguin, all of whom have been invited as well. And they're seemingly brought in by this guy on a boat, which is kind of creepy in terms of how he looks. It's almost like crossing the river Styx, right? Where like you have to pay the coins to the guy on the boat. I don't remember what his name is. He has an actual name in Greek and Roman theology, but nonetheless, they're basically brought to this house, right? It's called the House of Tartarus, where they meet with the Designer for the very first time. And it's kind of nuts here because the Designer sort of pops up and really says, like, when he's talking to the Joker, he's like, you're the clown prince of crime, like your reputation precedes you. The indication here is that the Designer knows everything about these guys. Now, when they are brought here, their weapons are basically handed over to make sure that nothing pops off, but it's kind of a cool thing. The other cool thing about this is the Designer looks amazing, right? In terms of his design, he looks absolutely awesome, but it's kind of a cool thing because what we also end up learning is that with this guy here, with the Designer, in his past, he had basically come across a kind of detective, and there is more to the story, but we'll figure out, what that is later on down the line. But this Designer had basically faced off against this detective and ultimately found what we basically see with Batman comics all the time, that the villain fights the good guy and the good guy always wins because the good guy's always one or two steps ahead. The Designer kind of found himself in this constant struggle of always losing because the detective he was fighting was just that much more intelligent than he was. And he came to the realization that in order to win, he has to outthink the detective. More so than that, it can't just be a plan the detective doesn't expect. He has to be so far ahead that by the time the detective realizes there's no chance for him to win, he's already lost. And ultimately, the Designer ended up spending a year inside of his own facility, right? His own kind of base of operations, for lack of a better word, and just kept coming up with all these ideas and all these plans that were so advanced and so nuanced, the detective never saw them coming. And the only real indication we get here is that the detective was not actually killed by the Designer. Instead, he was left essentially disgraced, right? He was left disgraced and for the most part, the world seems to have lost faith in him. And ultimately, he just ended up dying, seemingly of old age, but just ended up dying, realizing that he was defeated by what seemed to be either his greatest foe or any one of the many foes that he faced off against. But the Designer proved to be successful in that regard. And so what it does is it basically allows the Designer to tell the various people, these various villains, the story and then say, I can help all of you achieve your goal. Now, it's interesting the way that Tynion writes this, because the villains really just kind of seem to go along with it, right? I mean, the reputation of the designer really seems to kind of solidify that he's a guy that deserves to be believed, but there's no guarantee that his reputation is really accurate outside of the various rumors and hearsay that the villains have heard. And so we're just kind of left to assume that the designer is actually correct, right? He can do this stuff because his reputation is such that the individuals who are telling the story are beyond contestation as far as these various villains are concerned. But it is a pretty cool concept here. And so with Catwoman and with the Riddler and with Penguin meeting with the designer in turn, they all kind of come out really a lot happier than they were going in, because there seems to be truth to the idea that the designer can help them achieve their goals. Now, the whole reason behind this is the designer can get rich, right? He's like, I'm going to help all of you achieve your goals, but I want half of all your earnings, right? I want half of everything you take, and then we'll just, you'll never hear from me again. And so finally, the designer meets with the Joker. And as we know, the Joker is really kind of a wild card. You never really know what's going to happen. And so somehow we don't really know what was said, but the result was that when the Joker had his conversation with the designer immediately comes out and it's just like, kill them all. So whenever the Joker said, piss this guy off nice and good. Not only that, with everything popping off, right? Like all these forces of the designer coming after all the various villains who were here, the Joker ends up revealing that he still has a gun that he kept hidden, and he shoots the designer in the head, and that seems to be the end of him. Not only that, the various henchmen of the designer are taken out. The Joker seemingly killed everybody here. It is kind of nuts, because it's like, what in the world could the Joker have possibly said to this guy that would have led to this becoming what it was? Not only that, you also end up having the villains here saying, okay, then we're going to sweep this under the rug. This is going to be our dirty little secret. And that's kind of the secret they were referencing in the video that we did last time, right? They all kind of share this mutual secret. We didn't really know how deep it went, but basically the designer was the guy who was going to help them achieve their goals. None of their goals could be achieved without the funding of the designer, which really seemed to be kind of the plan, right? Like, I'll tell you how you can achieve your goal, but it's all for naught if you don't have the financial backing to do it, right? The money to be able to pull it off. And so they have these plans with no means to achieve them. And so they end up kind of sweeping the whole thing under the rug. But for the Joker himself, where they burn Tartarus' house and just kind of leave it there, the Joker is kind of staring off at the distance. And that's when Catwoman comments that she began to realize how evil the Joker is going to become, because the Joker basically knows what his plan is. He knows what he can do. And the Joker could essentially find a way to bypass the finances needed by the designer and then in turn pull it off on his own anyway. Not only that, when Catwoman finishes this conversation with Batman, Batman comes to the realization that the plan of Catwoman was to basically rob him. Her plan was to rob Bruce Wayne. And so if the designer could help her achieve that goal, then the designer knew that Batman is Bruce Wayne. Not only that, the designer knows how to access his family's wealth, meaning Batman could seemingly lose everything. And so what it does is it switches over to the Joker, basically in the modern day, talking to a bartender, essentially drinking what looks like a margarita. But he kind of starts telling the story from his perspective and basically says that during this meeting they had with the designer, that the designer basically said, I can help you guys achieve these various goals, right? And so ultimately he said, like, each of you guys will get a boon, you'll basically get some kind of financial backing, so on and so forth. And so ultimately the Penguin wanted to be king of Gotham City, right? He wanted to be the mayor. He wanted to be the one to run the show. The Riddler wanted to be the smartest person in Gotham City, and Catwoman wanted to be the wealthiest. But with Joker sitting down and looking at this and realizing that there would be no room for the designer in Gotham City itself, the Joker came to the realization that what the designer intended to do was help them achieve their goals, and then with nobody else there, take them all out, and then seemingly be the only one to conquer Gotham City. Or the indication is that Joker was the one who wanted to do that. But basically what he told the designer is, if you're the devil, then I want to take your place. I want to kill you, and I want to be the one to conquer Gotham City. And that seems to have been the reason why the designer kind of freaked out, because the Joker was the one that seemed to pick up on what it was that was actually happening. Again, this is Joker, and the way he tells his stories are oftentimes ambiguous in the sense that we don't know if they're ever true. We don't know if he's ever really telling the truth. But again, what it does is it basically picks up with Deathstroke and Batman on, Batman hot on his trail. The fact that Harley Quinn is basically kind of blowing through all the various devices of Batman, and Batman ends up chiming into Lucius Fox and saying, like, shut down her control of these things. She's basically spending money like water through a sieve. That's not okay. That's the problem. Bruce Wayne ultimately manages to track down Deathstroke, and of course he ends up taking him captive, or at least, Deathstroke jumps onto the Batwing and then just starts like attacking it and so on and so forth. One thing that does happen here is Catwoman ends up locating Harley Quinn, and then the two of them basically leave for track down the designer or something along those lines. They're met by a couple of Jokerized members from the Gotham City Police Department. This kind of seems to be partially a scheme of the Joker. We're not entirely sure here, but what it does is it allows a kind of battle between Batman and Deathstroke. Now, the reality is that this has kind of been done to death, right? Batman versus Deathstroke. But what makes this interesting is the conversation between the two, because what you end up having here is Deathstroke and Batman really having this conversation where Batman kind of looks around and says, like, down there in Gotham City, there's 9 million people. And ironically enough, their faith in their government actually went up when Bane took control. It's one of these interesting things. We talked about that in the City of Bane story arc. Like, people would say, God, it's terrible that Bane took over Gotham and all that kind of stuff. But at the end, according to the people there, he made the city a better place. That Batman's not really willing to do what it takes in order to actually win this battle. That's the interesting thing about the Batman mythos, is I hear people kind of create these arguments all the time of like, well, if that were the logic, then like Superman should kill his villains and Spider-Man should kill his villains and so on and so forth. But Batman categorically and unequivocally has the worst, most violent rogues gallery in all of comic books. And that's why there's a legitimate case to make there in saying that Batman should kill all his villains, right? Because the city of Gotham would be better off with all those various villains dead. It's cool because Batman kind of looks at this and says, yeah, like this city is the way it is because of me. And it's one of these things where he almost kind of tries to play it based on like, well, I mean, my parents died when I was a little kid. They were shot in an alley and I had to go down this path and all this kind of stuff. And Deathstroke's not buying it. He's like, at the end of the day, man, you can come to me with whatever story you want to, but you escalated. We were criminals doing criminal things. You're the one who donned a cloak and cowl, and then you're the one that started taking us out the way that you did. We had to step up because you stepped up. You're sort of left asking the question, right? If Bruce Wayne becoming Batman is what led to criminals becoming more violent, then is Batman really the reason why Gotham is the way it is? Were criminals ever going to become that violent in the first place, or did they only ever really get that way because of Batman? It's interesting to look at it for the other, from the other side of the equation. And so Batman tries to reason with Deathstroke, and it's like, look, I'm trying to change the fact that I've gotten extreme in recent years, because he has. Batman's become more and more extreme as comics have gone on. You look at like Silver Age Batman, and then you compare him to like Batman from like Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, the New 52. Batman's gotten more and more extreme over the years, because remember, it's all just one cohesive continuity now, right? So Batman has gotten more extreme over the years, and where he's like, I'm trying to change this extreme nature, but what I need you guys to do is to basically slow down and stop. The response of Deathstroke is, no, that's not going to happen, right? Like, we're not going to slow down, we're not going to stop. And so Batman basically like just lunges at him and sends the both of them flying off the Batwing. And ultimately, Deathstroke calls his bluff, right? He's like, look, man, you can do this all day long if you want to, but we both know you're going to shoot one of your bat grappling guns, right? So just do that, do the damn thing, and then save us, right? And that's exactly what he does, right? He shoots a grappling hook and basically ends up saving him and Deathstroke, and that's essentially it. And it's kind of a funny thing, because Deathstroke can essentially play Batman like a fiddle. Batman's predictable. There's just a line that Batman won't cross. And because the villains know Batman won't cross that line, at the end of the day, he's always only ever a half measure, because it's kind of like, I won't do what needs to be done in order to save Gotham City, because I don't believe in killing, right? My parents were killed and, yada, 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 and so on and so forth. But sometimes it's in the best interest to kill a villain, right? It's in the interest of people. By Batman not killing his villains, all he's doing is sacrificing innocent lives, right? He's saying like the thousands of people that Joker's going to kill over the course of a year or several years or something like that, they are not as valuable as the Joker's life, right? The Joker being redeemed is more valuable than those innocent people. And that's why it's always an interesting question. How many lives is Batman willing to sacrifice before he says enough is enough? Because in the end, if he has the means to kill the Joker, but he doesn't, he is in effect sacrificing those people's lives. And so where the designer finally pops up to Batman and basically says, Deathstroke, you're done now, indicating to Deathstroke that he's going to get screwed over on his contract, Batman's kind of like, come and face me. And the response to the designer is, no, we still have one more game left. And that's when Edward Nygma, the Riddler, pops up and says, the entirety of Gotham City is now under my control. I've split the entire city into what's basically a giant crossword puzzle. And there's these enormous walls as tall as buildings, and it's like, everybody stay put where you are. The only way the entire city is going to be let loose is if Batman's able to correctly solve this crossword puzzle. If he guesses wrong, then I basically blow up a bomb, right? And the indication here is that if he guesses like 3 across and like 4 down, and he gets it wrong, that section gets destroyed with a bomb. And so lives are basically in jeopardy here. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Like, this wouldn't be a problem if Edward Nygma were dead. And so it's kind of interesting, because ultimately Lucius Fox cannot really locate where Edward Nygma is, where the Riddler is, and Nygma just starts cutting off Batman's communications in order to force him in a situation where he has to use his own wits in order to be able to pull this off. And it's kind of cool, because this is an insane amount of hubris on behalf of the Riddler, because where this kind of starts going down, Batman ends up, of course, taking Deathstroke, who's currently handcuffed, and then takes him to like a Batman train. Literally, Batman has a bat train. And so while that's happening, while Batman's facing off against these forces of the designer, who are seemingly kind of coming out of nowhere and waiting on this train to arrive, then you end up having Riddler, who's asking these questions, right? 1 across, 9 spaces. The more I take, the more I leave behind. Batman's response, Footsteps. Joker comes in, 8 down, 5 spaces. What has many keys but can open no doors? Batman's response, piano. He's answering all these things like that, right? Just off the top of his head. And this is James Tynion really showing the intelligence of Bruce Wayne. This is one of the most important aspects, and it's one of the coolest things, right? Because like when you look at Snyder's Batman run, what really showcased Bruce Wayne's intelligence was the small things, right? Now, some of that was because it's Batman comics, Batman can't die, because, you know, he's just too popular for DC to kill off. He just sells too well, right? And so that's why Batman always comes out on top. But to see a display of his intelligence like this, just constantly countering Edward Nygma's questions, every time he asks a scenario, Batman basically answers almost perfectly, right? 10 across, 11 spaces. A woman shoots her husband, holds him underwater for 5 minutes, hangs him, and then takes him out to dinner. How is that possible? The response of Batman, photography. She took a picture of him, right? Being able to like counter every single one of Edward Nygma's riddles off the top of his head with the greatest of ease, despite being completely battle worn and totally exhausted, shows how far above Edward Nygma Batman really is. And that's where Nygma starts getting pissed off. And that was always his weakness, right? In comics, that was always the weakness of Edward Nygma. He would let his temper get the better of him if Batman started getting the better of him. It was just kind of it was always the thing that ended up catching him off guard. Now from here, this picks up with Catwoman and Harley Quinn in a pretty interesting scenario, right? We end up finding out what it is that Harley Quinn and Catwoman are actually up to. And in reality, it's just Catwoman. Harley Quinn's just kind of along for the ride. But we end up finding out that what Catwoman is looking for is someone called the Underbroker. And this is an individual who basically has access to essentially every bank account across the entirety of Gotham City. You can access anybody's account using the help of this particular guy. Now, Catwoman says that she has the account numbers, that she is a member of their club in good standing, and this basically leads to Catwoman being allowed in by the Underbroker himself. The issue with this is that as Catwoman gets in there, they're met by the arrival of Punchline. The Punchline is actually there. Not only that, this is when Harley Quinn meets the Joker's new girlfriend for the very first time, and it is cool because Harley Quinn doesn't initially know that. Instead, it's just kind of like Punchline's like, I'm here to make a withdrawal too. I'm the punchline. I'm where you end. It's kind of a lame phrase to have, but it is a cool thing to see them encounter each other, because when Harley Quinn's like, who in the world is this person? Catwoman's like, she's the Joker's new girlfriend. And Harley's like, oh, this girl's in for a time. You would think Harley Quinn would be pissed about being replaced, right? Like, oh, no. Let me tell you something. Harley Quinn is often imitated, never duplicated. That's not the response, right? That's not what happens. Instead, Harley's kind of like, okay, so like you're in for a rough ride. Like, I know it seems cool to be the Joker's new girlfriend at the moment. He's gonna screw you up in ways that you can't even begin to imagine yet. Not only that, Harley's whole thing is like, are you funny? Because you don't really sound funny. And like Punchline tries to make a few sort of veiled threats and outright threats and tries to make a few jokes here and there. But at the end of the day, Harley's not buying it. She's like, I've been around this block more than a few times. You got nothing. You got nothing, no jokes, no puns, no anything. You are a poor man's Harley Quinn. And then she basically tells her, like, in a few years and a few dozen cries in the shower and so on and so forth, I'm gonna buy you a frozen margarita and we're gonna have a girl-to-girl chat about how you made the worst decision of your life. But until then, I'm gonna bash your head in with a hammer. And immediately attacks the girl. I love that. Not only that, of course, Catwoman ends up getting her hand on the Underbroker, and then we end up finding out, who this guy is, right? That his name is Harlan Graves. This guy has all kinds of information, but Catwoman knows everything about him as well. And so it's like, if you don't tell me what I want to know, I'm going to start spewing all your private information for Harley Quinn and for Punchline to hear. And if you don't want me to do that, you're going to take me to a computer terminal to get me where I need to go. The reality and what seems to be going on here is that if the designer does have the plan of Catwoman, which was to rob Bruce Wayne, and seemingly has sent Punchline for that purpose to access that computer terminal, then of course Catwoman is there to basically withdraw those funds or to move those funds to a different location so that the designer can't get his hands on them, right? So Bruce Wayne doesn't lose everything. And so with that being the case, Batman ends up tracking down the Riddler after he recognizes where it is the Riddler's at. He takes out the Riddler, right? It's not a great big huge thing. Riddler's not really physically capable in comparison to Batman. The Riddler's taken out pretty quickly. Batman basically knocks out Deathstroke with a tranquilizer dart. That's enough to keep an elephant asleep for a few hours. So on Deathstroke, it'll probably work for like half an hour, 45 minutes, because of his healing factor. And so Batman is basically kind of met by the arrival of the designer who says, it's cool, you've unraveled all your adversaries' designs. That's awesome, but it's not going to be enough, because you must know that if I'm in Bruce Wayne's office, then it means I must know who you are. And the designer confirms that in saying, hello, Bruce Wayne, it's time that you and I have a conversation before I kill you. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.